heard in other meetings are students and former colleagues of Professor Kannan who have been in touch with him for a very, very long time. So this is how he builds these bonds, and it's great that KK Biotech has given us this opportunity to be able to meet together once in a while and exchange our views, what we are doing, and if nothing else, just have a good laugh over a joke or something. But at the same time, an activity like this also brings together um, around topics of diverse interest. And the beauty of it is that he has very nicely um, called the series along the legend of Yellaprada Subbarao. They lived so that humanity can live ever after. And in that series, to be really able to do justice to contemporary topics of science that we do in the context of those stellar contributions that those people have made is both very challenging and humbling at the same time. So I'll do my best. Will try not to bore you with the technical details of my own lab work. I'm trained in molecular biology, and that's really what I do for most of my research. But most of what I'm usually talked about is anything other than my molecular biology, and that's both the good and the bad aspects of it. Um, and it happens, as John and Lennon says, life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. So when I was busy trying to be a molecular biologist, I seem to have earned some good name or a bad name, either as a student activist or as a journalist or as a policy commentator or whatever else. But I was once asked this question in a faculty interview in a university. Oh, you've been doing so many things. What is the problem? I said, there's no problem. The question to be asked is, am I doing well whatever I'm doing? Everything else is irrelevant. At my age, I really don't have choice to pick what I want to do. I do whatever I find interesting and useful, and I derive a lot of satisfaction out of it. And if it also happens to be carried out well, nothing like it. So I would rather like to be judged on whether I do well what I take rather than how many different things I do. Like many people, sometimes I get carried away on what ought to be done rather than what is most rewarding to be done. That's been again my merit as well as demerit. So I don't want to bore you with any more introduction. Let me just go straight to my topic of the day. Can you all see the slides? And can you hear me all right, by the way?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, certainly,
Yes.
please.
All right. So, yeah, under this series of great contributors to humanity, I was called to talk about Norman Borlaug, but I had suggested that in the area of work that I do, especially nitrogen management, Norman Borlaug's work is best understood in the context of the Haber-Bosch process of nitrogen fixation, which um, in the beginning of the last century has made it possible to fix atmospheric ammonia into atmospheric nitrogen gas into ammonia. From there came all the fertilizers, industrially manufactured nitrogen fertilizers, urea, ammonium nitrate, diammonium phosphate, etc. And from there came all the nitrate compounds used in ammunition for the world wars, both the world wars. And that kept this whole area growing. And the industrial revolution and the need for industrial feedstocks also has kept this Haber-Bosch process very popular. For over a century, this has remained the undisputed leader of industrial processes and won two Nobel Prizes. And because Haber-Bosch process was there, that Borlaug could actually bring it to use in moving forward with green revolution. And yet, within half a century, we are now stuck with both these things. The Haber-Bosch process, which needs to be replaced with a more environment friendly process, and we don't have an alternative for more than half a century now, and we need to be able to find a more sustainable way of green revolution, because it has reached a situation where it is challenging sustainability. So both these we try to understand in the context of what they did, and what challenges we now face for things that could not have been predicted or understood at the time when they were invented. So Norman Ernst Borlaug was an American agronomist, a field that basically puts together various other disciplines of crop science, the genetics, the soil science, the physiology, the plant breeding, into an applied, unified process. That's what agronomists do. And he was born on a farm to farming parents in Iowa, and he went on to be the director of the CIMIT, the Institute of Maize Research in Mexico, under the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research (CGIAR), uh, which is affiliated to the UN Food and World Agricultural Organization, and there are quite a few institutes of the CGIAR in different parts of the world. We have one of them, ICRISAT in Hyderabad, and there's one on rice in Philippines. The one in Mexico was on wheat. He was heading that, and he identified the best known high yielding short height disease resistant variety of wheat by essentially trying to bring together these different traits with the help of plant breeders who introgressed all these traits into a particular variety. It took him more than a decade, 2 decades, to be able to bring it out in the 50s, 1950s. And then in Mexico, an improved wheat variety was released. From there, it was spread to India and Pakistan and elsewhere. Later, rice was also taken up in India, and then in Pakistan. Other cereal crops have been picked up in other parts of the world, but wheat and rice continue to be the best examples of grain revolution. They were heavily supported by the national governments at that time. The Mexican government in the Mexican example, and the Indian government in the Indian example, particularly spearheaded by on the scientific side by Professor M.S. Swaminathan, and who himself, by the way, is a winner of the Norman Borlaug Food Prize, and C. Subramaniam, a bureaucrat who has been uh, a very strong support for the planning and the um, administrative aspects of green revolution, plus a huge support that came from Indian government in terms of funding for all the irrigation programs, for all the tractors, fertilizers, subsidies. So a whole lot of money came. Some money was also put in by US aid, and US foundations, especially Rockefeller and Ford Foundation, had played a very important role those days. Sometimes people consider them to be controversial. That was because that was the time when the world was heavily divided into left and right, and uh, there was a bipolar world, and there was a cold war, and food was considered to be a major and poverty and food were considered to be major nucleating factors for left movements all over the world, and America considered food to be an important part of its foreign policy, and the PL 480 Food for Peace program, which was effectively used by America right since then in the 50s until most recently in the Iraq, before the Iraq war. Food has always been an important foreign policy weapon, in the US hands. But this was a very interesting case of actually using food production improvement technologies as a way of um, befriending countries which would have otherwise been um, in the shadow of the USSR those days, and also help them to become more independent and more productive in food, and through that preempt or prevent um, revolutions coming up in those places. And if people call it a conspiracy, but if it was a conspiracy, I must say it was a pretty successful conspiracy at that. Um, Whichever way you look at it, whichever side of the divide one belongs to. But those are, just side points which I just wanted to flag, so that you don't think I'm painting a very um, monolithic picture of all that is rosy about green revolution. There were a lot of other things around that at that time. But the reason, in spite of all that, it was a reasonable success was because it was government led, and it was intergovernmentally supported, from abroad and so on. And there were heavy investments um, in irrigation, fertilizers, pesticides, tractors, water pumps, harvesters. Well, storage facilities have, for except the food corporation, the storage facility which developed very very slowly over many decades. Um, and processing which still has not developed. Um, all the others had developed much faster, and supply chains are yet to be developed in for many things. But then in different countries, these combinations of various factors worked in different ways to different extents, and therefore you see different trajectories and in different crops. Some are cash crops, but mostly the success was in cereals to begin with, and later each country tried to carry it forward in its own way in the crops of their interest. Um, so the cereal yields are said to have more than doubled since the Green Revolution within about 50 to 60 years. Uh, but then, within a couple of decades, it became very obvious that fertilizer pollution, pesticide poisoning, soil uh, quality degradation, yields plateauing, whole lot of other problems, and land use changes, cropping pattern changes, all of them have started happening with effects that probably would were either not understood or were underestimated at the time when this whole enthusiasm around green revolution existed. For us, from the nitrogen point of view, an important issue was that the legume based rotations, where any two crops would always be rotated with the legume. Either you have a cereal legume cereal, or you have a vegetable legume vegetable, or you have a fruit legume fruit. A legume is always used to be traditionally a part of a cropping mix, and that's what used to bring the nitrogen fertilizer without any chemical or industrial intervention, simply by the microbes symbiotically fixing the nitrogen from the air at room temperature in the plant and making it available for the plant's needs. And in return, the microbes were taking some photosynthetic sugars that the plants were making, because they were able to harvest light and carbon dioxide, which many of these microbes could not. So this symbiosis was actually serving a very important part of the biogeochemical cycle of nitrogen to make agriculture possible. And it is simply by using this cereal um, legume and non-legume rotation that human beings have managed agriculture sustainably for 10,000 years. Green Revolution unfortunately could not sustain it without huge environmental damage for even half a century. So that's why we are coming back to terms like evergreen revolution, sustainable agriculture, and various other terms. It's not that everything is bad with Green Revolution, but some of these issues had to be um, properly addressed in order to make it sustainable. Another aspect, especially in India, that happened was rain-fed areas did not get much benefit of Green Revolution. Most of the Green Revolution was centered around, harvesting the low-hanging fruits, as they say, in places which had rivers like Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP, and where, with some irrigation programs and canals, uh, the available river waters can be readily made use of, and huge improvement in, and by focusing all the other inputs in those very states where water was already available, it was easier to implement the Green Revolution there. So that's why much of the Green Revolution got limited to a few, very few states. I mean, actually, less than 10% of the total cropped area of the country. And that meant that the remaining 90% of the rain-fed agriculture area um, has been left to fend for itself, other than some of the accessory benefits like fertilizers, tractors, which will only be used when there is water. If there is no water, none of the other inputs will be used. So this actually created a problem of uneven development, uneven agricultural development, and uneven agricultural economic impacts, backlash, which people try to understand and explain in various ways. Vandana Shiva called it the violence of Green Revolution. Other people called it the failed promise of Green Revolution. Whatever they have called, that's all social science beyond my um, ability to do justice. But I just wanted to flag that the great work that started by these great people, and did produce quite interesting results in many parts of the world in in pretty short time scales, did nevertheless bring up many challenges which could not be addressed. Maybe they did not have the kind of champions um, of that type, and that nor were there that kind of investments coming through. And without such investments and without such strong government and intergovernmental involvement, transition of green revolution into sustainable agriculture or evergreen revolution would not have been possible. And that's precisely what Professor M.S. Swaminathan has later on advocated repeatedly. Uh, the last time he did that was in the Farmers Commission, whose reports are yet to be implemented, and we are having a whole crisis with farmers on the streets, um, either agitating or simply bringing their produce and throwing on the streets because input costs are rising, and output costs are falling. So their incomes are falling, their expenditures are rising, and um, it doesn't look like they have a solution that is convincing to them that they can embrace um, so far. We will have to see whether it will come up as we go along. There are also a few other perspectives on Green Revolution. I don't want to spend any time on this, but just to flag and leave it. The top picture on the left is the Food and Agricultural Organization figure that shows that on a global scale from 1961 to 2001, and of course it is more or less true even till now, while the cropped area remained roughly a constant, the production, the total production has increased without any significant increase in the cropped area, which means the yield per unit area has also increased, and that's how the total production has increased without using the land area. But then, at least in the Indian case, uh, there was an article last into 2019 by David Stone from a US agricultural university in the Geographical Journal, which says that The Indian Green Revolution, if you look at the increase in yields, though the Green Revolution mainly focused on wheat and rice, but if you look at the non-Green Revolution cereals like the core cereals, they also had continuous increase. How did they have when they were not a part of the Green Revolution? Number one. Number two, there was this question that it is often also a question of which year you use to compare Green Revolution, because the Green Revolution in India was introduced in 1969, and 2 years before that there was very severe drought. So if you took the figures immediately preceding the Green Revolution year, it will appear that you got very dramatic yield improvements in the subsequent years. But if you are taken, but that was a very odd year of very severe drought. But if you are taken either the long-term average in the past or pre-drought years, then this dotted line that shows um, a continuous increase, which is more or less in the same trajectory with or without Green Revolution. Then there are other people who say that the slope was much shallower in the pre-revolution years, and the slope became much sharper in the post-Green Revolution years. Now these are different perspectives. I thought that you should know. Um, they may all be right when you correctly understand the basis of the data and the examples that they are using and the comparison years they are using, but they may start with their own strong uh, views about whether they want to support or oppose green revolution. But this discussion continues. But regardless of this, the issue of environmental and sustainability impacts of green revolution is universal. There is no controversy on that. Also, on the top right, I have shown the latest article in One Earth, just I think last this month, earlier this month, saying that if you look at the world trade, globalization, and biodiversity loss, climate change, you will see that all of them impact one another in multiple ways, and one cannot say that the current manner in which agriculture is organized and agriculture is a part of the you know globalized commodity trade in agricultural goods and agricultural inputs, one cannot say that it is ideally situated in terms of the safety of the environment, the safety of the biodiversity, and in terms of preventing climate change. Now, the same thing, another group, which includes a colleague of mine from Austria, they have published an article in Nature Food, which just appeared 2 days ago, which more clearly showed that if you look at the partial factor productivity from the 1960s to the 2010s, that is the last decade, whether you take in terms of kilocalories per unit nitrogen input, that is basically starch produced per um, nitrogen added, that the top two graphs in the bottom square, or the right hand bottom graph, or the last two at the bottom, which show kilogram protein per kg and input, you see that both have fallen consistently over the decades. So the nitrogen partial factor productivity for yield, as well as nitrogen partial factor productivity of kg protein, have both fallen. Whereas nitrogen fertilizer has increased in both scenarios. So that's a matter of concern. One would expect that a free market globalized scenario would actually optimize everything towards higher input use efficiency, higher economic efficiency, higher labor productivity, etc., etc. These economics, I'm not an expert in that, but I know that these are considered as assumptions in a free market, but that doesn't seem to be actually happening. So those who are interested in these things might want to look at these articles. Now, from the nitrogen point of view, and I'm not going to go back to Borlaug or Haber-Bosch anymore. Um, well, I'll come to Haber-Bosch though. Um, One thing that most people seem to agree is that among all the various inputs that have made green revolution possible, nitrogen fertilizer is one thing that more or less is considered to be the most important driver of green revolution. And it is estimated, as you can see from here, about half the population that exists in the world today would not have existed if you did not have synthetic nitrogen fertilizers in food production at that time. That's a big statement to make, um, but this is what it is, and the references are given there, and that's what I'm going to base my rest of the talk about, on. Norman Borlaug would not have achieved half of the success, or anybody after him would not have achieved half the success of green revolution if they did not have access to nitrogen fertilizers. Um, and that's what this graph shows. But the technology for nitrogen fertilizers, the chemical industrial manufacture of large scale nitrogen fertilizers, was invented half a century prior to Norman Borlaug. It was invented in early 1900s, whereas Norman Borlaug started this work in the 1950s in Mexico. So the pre-existence of the industrial process for converting atmospheric nitrogen gas into ammonia in the presence of metal catalysts, which is what basically the process was initially on a lab scale invented by Frisch Haber, and it was scaled up by Carl Bosch, a chemical engineer, and he's considered a godly figure in chemical engineering for this work he did. Both of them won Nobel Prizes at different times. And the process, which had very quickly replaced a couple of other processes that existed at that time, like the Birkeland-Ide process that was invented in Norway, and a Frank Caro process also in Europe. These processes were actually far more inefficient and are not very amenable to large scale production. So Haber-Bosch process virtually replaced all previous processes, and till date it continues to be the most important chemical method of breaking the nitrogen bond in air and converting a relatively inert nitrogen molecule into reactive nitrogen molecules like nitrate, like ammonia, from where a lot of other things are made, not only fertilizers and also ammunition, as I said, but plastics and a whole lot of other things. So, nitrogen fertilizers are primarily made of either urea or ammonium soft phosphate or ammonium nitrate, or potassium nitrate, sodium nitrate, any nitrate salt. But all of them have nitrate in common or ammonium in common. By oxidizing ammonium, you can make nitrate, or by reducing nitrate, you can make ammonium. So, the availability of these fertilizers has been a major factor in the green revolution, and but then this process is highly demanding. It uses, you know, 1450 pounds per square inch of pressure and temperatures up to 500 degrees Celsius, and can cause accidents much worse than the Bhopal gas disaster. In fact, the plant that blew up in Bhopal gas disaster actually had was using this kind of technology, and yet we do not have a more environment friendly technology for making reactive nitrogen, whether for ammunition or for fertilizers, um, and that alone might get somebody who invents it the next Nobel Prize. Despite the advantage of this industrial process being the only process that is currently available for the nitrogen fertilizers, the real reason why this process became very popular and very demanding all over the world was because it also was the main route to make ammunition for weapons during the world wars. And Germany did not have at that time the access to guano and natural sources of nitrogen, nitrogen rich soils, or bird droppings and things like that, which Britain had access to. So geopolitics was as much an important part of some of these discoveries. Now, we quickly fast forward 50 years um, from Norman Borlaug. We went 50 years back from Norman Borlaug to talk about Haber and Bosch. Now we go 50 years forward from Norman Borlaug Green Revolution to understand as it exists in the 21st century. The broad situation, as we understand now, is that agriculture, forestry, and land use cause about 24% of greenhouse gas emissions, as was reported in the 2010 fifth assessment report of IPCC. The sixth one, only the physical science basis report has come. The detailed reports are yet to come. So we will get more recent figures for 2021 when they come out. Most of these emissions were during the post-harvest management stage. As I said, nitrogen is the biggest input for food, feed, fiber globally. Agriculture is also the biggest source of nitrogen pollution. Some of the fertilizer that is not picked up by the plant can either evaporate into the air as ammonia or nitrous oxide, or it can dissolve and escape into the groundwater, or can flow on surface water and contaminate the surface water bodies. When agricultural residues are burnt, they can produce NOx. So together, agriculture has also become a very, very serious source of nitrogen pollution. 20 to 30% of food systems are already industrialized, globalized, and the supply chains, the amount of fossil fuels used to transport, primary food commodities, the amount of coal-based or thermal energy that is used to store them, process them, all that adds to the total greenhouse gas footprint of agriculture. There are also huge disparities in consumption, which are driving unsustainable production. For example, an average Westerner consumes more than twice the amount of meat than is required for a healthy Western adult. But to produce that meat, the amount of water, fertilizer, plant inputs, because plant material becomes feed for animals which become meat. So the whole food chain loses its efficiency as you go higher and higher. I'll show you a slide on that. And more importantly, nitrous oxide is 300 times more powerful greenhouse gas because of its global warming potential and highly reactive nature than carbon dioxide. Even NOx is 10 times more powerful than carbon dioxide on a century long scale. So this is why we are concerned about some of the side effects of green revolution, and why we think that sustainable nitrogen management in agriculture and beyond is extremely important, not only for climate change but for many other sustainable development goals beyond climate. Now, this is just one snapshot I thought I should show you. This graph from Trends in Plant Science at the top shows the tapering off of actual yields with increase in applied fertilizer. So in the beginning, you get very, very good response as you keep, just like enzyme kinetics curves, as you keep supplying the fertilizer when it is in limiting conditions, you get good response in yield. But as it no longer is limiting, yield saturate. But farmers keep adding more fertilizer thinking that they'll get more, and sometimes governments don't discourage them, or might even implicitly encourage them by their policies, and that might end up being governed by law of diminishing returns, and more and more of unused fertilizer left behind in the environment, only causing pollution. Now the bottom graph shows um, the population in billions on the uh, primary axis and the reactive nitrogen creation in teragrams per year on the secondary axis over a period of time. As you can see, the reactive nitrogen creation by legumes, which was a part of agriculture for 10,000 years, has not created such a huge increase in the reactive nitrogen. But it is the Haber-Bosch process and chemical manufacture of fertilizer, the green graph, that has hugely increased the uh, reactive nitrogen in the environment. Between them, and of course, some of it also comes from burning fossil fuels, whether coal or oil or diesel, for energy or for power or for transport. And so, if you add all these three major sources of reactive nitrogen, you get the total, which is actually growing at the same rate, or in fact faster than that of the population. So that's in a snapshot our link with the population, our link as a population with nitrogen. Also, an important point to understand that agriculture is not only harmed by climate change because productivity falls, yields fall, but agriculture itself causes climate change. So it works both ways. And in any case, climate is not just carbon dioxide, but also a whole lot of other greenhouse gases, including methane, nitrous oxide, NOx, and others. Methane emissions from rice fields in flooded, paddy, as well as from enteric belching in cows are already well known. Nitrous oxide has replaced methane as the second largest greenhouse gas from agriculture 15 years ago in India, and we still only talk of nitrogen or methane, carbon or methane, when it comes to climate, and nitrogen is in many ways neglected or marginalized. Improving nitrogen use efficiency, um, either by only adding as much fertilizer as the crop needs or by going back to legume based rotations, because when you remove the pulse from the legume, whatever nitrogen is still left behind in the soil will meet much of the requirement of the next crop. You may top up a little bit with manure or something, but the total demand will become very, very low. And we believe that the yield centric crop improvement programs, which considered water and fertilizer as unlimited inputs, non limiting inputs, may have actually unknowingly selected for decreasing nitrogen use efficiency or decreasing water use efficiency, or for that matter decreasing input use efficiency. uh, Evidence for that is now gradually beginning to come in the field of nitrogen, where people have found that two genes which were considered to be very crucial in green revolution, SD1 and LHD1, which were very important for that dwarf variety um, used in green revolution, they were also apparently responsible for low nitrogen use efficiency. So there is some kind of trade-off uh, between green revolution and nitrogen use efficiency. That evidence is just beginning to emerge. And at the heart of this is that most crop improvement programs, as they are still suffering the legacy issues of the of the heady days of green revolution, they don't have low input screening program. They always give saturating amounts of water and fertilizer. They don't screen for what happens if you give a little less. Will it still take? So that's also part of the problem. So this is the overall nitrogen cycle. Um, as on the left you see the various sources of nitrogen, like legumes or biological fixation, and the bottom fertilizer manufacture or industrial combustion of fossil fuels. All of them enter the environment in various ways. Some directly go to air and may get washed down as along with rain as acid rain, and some go into crops and but some of it goes back into water as leach nitrate in the groundwater or surface water. But through dung and urine and all, some gaseous loss as ammonia might happen, and some microbial conversions might also produce nitrogen oxides or nitrous oxides. So there is a lot of exchange of reactive nitrogen species between crops, soil, water, and air. So this essentially is what should have been the biogeochemical cycle for nitrogen actually become a cascade. And that cascade has started leaving more nitrogen behind than what is required in the environment. The denitrification ability of converting reactive nitrogen back into N2 gas in nature is very limited. We don't have an industrial technology also for denitrification of reactive nitrogen. Now, that's another thing that might get a Nobel Prize. But till that happens, we are generating reactive nitrogen, not able to use all of it. So much of it remains in the environment, soil, water, air, and it keeps haunting us in various ways, changing biodiversity, causing climate change, affecting our health, getting deposited on carbon particles as particulate matter. People talk about PM 2.5, but nobody tells you that this particulate matter, what is the most dangerous thing in that? It is the nitrate and nitrogen compound deposits on the silica or carbon particle that is most dangerous for our health. Nitrogen is also relevant for all the 17 sustainable development goals, and especially these seven: hunger, health, uh, water quality, energy, production, consumption, climate change, uh, aquatic ecosystems, and life on land. And there are a whole range of international organizations which have been worried about importance of, which have nitrogen as a part of their work profile, though they may not all be giving the same emphasis to nitrogen as they should or as we might like. So to summarize what I have said so far, um, reactive nitrogen for our purpose mostly is these four groups of compounds: ammonia or ammonium salts, uh, ammonia gas or ammonium salts in water, nitric oxide or nitrogen dioxide, together called NOx, or dissolved nitrates in water, or nitrous oxide N2O, which is emitted into air. All of them are together, they constitute what we call reactive nitrogen. Their loss, uh, in some cases, they are byproducts. You don't deliberately want to lose them or make them, like in the case of fossil fuel burning. But in the case of fertilizer and manure, they could have actually been very useful components, but they are lost or they're wasted. And the wastage alone is $200 billion a year. And in India, the urea subsidy itself is 50,000 crores per year. I could have bought Air India with just 1 year of fertilizer subsidy money. I would not have had to give it to Tatas at 2,400 crores. Anyway, um, so this is just summarizing why nitrogen is important for sustainability. Many of the things I have already mentioned. Um, Important thing is that because of the high density of population and high consumption, urban environments are even worse affected than rural environments. Rural environments are more affected because of lack of proper sewage systems and those kinds of things, quality drinking water. But urban environments are also affected in quality of air and everything else. So assessment of nitrogen in all these places is important, and we've done that for India at least. And if you put India as a part of the global picture and pick the three most important components of air pollution, first is NOx, second is nitrous oxide, and third is ammonia. You see, the darker the color, the stronger the pollution. Okay, so different. These are actually compiled from different research papers. three different research papers given in the bottom. Um, so the color scheme is not consistent, but just consider the darker the color, stronger the pollution. As you can see, the northwest part of India is a major problem. Also, much of the central India is much of the problem for NOx pollution. The whole of India is a problem for nitrous oxide pollution, and again, northwest India is a major problem for ammonia pollution. And if you look at it on a global scale, you can see that India seems to be one of the hotspots of global nitrogen pollution. So we can't say we are a developing country and this and that. We are, at par with anybody else, whether in Western Europe or America or other parts of the world or Latin America. Um, well, we expect that some issues of nitrogen will also come up in the COP26 in Glasgow in weeks from now, though emphasis is still very much heavily on carbon. But this is just to flag that these issues are no longer a pure, scientific concerns. They are actually becoming important political concerns as well. We have also started extending the Indian data to South Asia, and we find that um, in the South Asian region, the European satellite data called EDGAR shows that all the three nitrogen species I've shown in the previous graph are growing above global means. NOx is in fact even growing per capita, so you can't hide behind the population figures. Indian emissions dominate the entire South Asia, so whatever India whatever good or bad management of nitrogen India does, that becomes the graph for the whole of South Asia. So India drives the whole trend of South Asia. Um, and that's because of the sheer size of the country and activity and everything else. Agriculture is the main source of of ammonia and nitrous oxide in the whole of South Asia, and NOx is mainly from transport, industry, and power. Fortunately, pollution is increasingly high on the public agenda. In Delhi, we even had some elections, mentioning air pollution as a part of their election manifestos. And reducing nitrogen pollution in air and water retards climate change, and is therefore you don't have to only do it for climate, because the problem is every government thinks climate is the problem of the next government, not mine. But if it is immediately affecting people, like something like COVID, every government will say, oh my God, I don't want to lose the next election. So the Western emphasis on nitrogen has been on climate. I would think that the nitrogen emphasis in developing world, including South Asia, should be around health. Our politicians will not talk very easily. If you talk climate, they say, "वो अगला सरकार देखेगा." Fortunately, we have the scientific and administrative capacity, and political consensus and will are what are needed, and we are beginning to see that emerging. I'll tell you the process that we went through. Um, at least when it comes to NOx emissions from various coal and transport, diesel, etc., if you compare all the other major air pollutants, this is CPCB table, it shows that NOx it ticks all the boxes: health effects, acid rain effects, eutrophication effects, climate effects, visibility effects, whereas carbon dioxide only has direct climate change effect, nothing else. And WHO data shows that millions of people's deaths every year are attributable to PM 2.5, and a whole lot of other diseases like lung cancer, stroke, heart disease, and lung disease due to air pollution, and nitrogen being the most prominent in terms of health effects, as well as particulate matter effects, PM, together might contribute very heavily to all these effects. And one recent global survey of asthma in children, published in 2019 in Lancet, showed that India is among the global hotspots. Of course, China is much worse for childhood asthma, and this is specifically attributing it to um, NOx pollution. In India alone, 1.6 million deaths per year attributable to air pollution. What is the number of people who died due to COVID in 1 year? We're probably killing more people with reactive nitrogen year after year than COVID would have killed in 1 year. And water pollution, these are all the red spots. The darker the color, higher the water pollution. Both organic, inorganic nitrogen pollution in the top world map and the organic nitrogen pollution in the bottom world map, produced by the UNEP project on global nutrient cycle, which we had the fortune of steering, produced this map, which is very informative for governments to take action. And this is a graph that some of you may have heard about or seen about. A very beautiful way of visualizing various abuses to the environment on the planet and which of them is at what level. These concentric circles using traffic light colors show the ability of the planet to take some of the abuses. Those which are in the red zone are the abuses that we may not be able to reverse completely. And once you cross the outermost circle, some damage is irreversible. And which are the two most damaging things that have happened among all these things? Nitrogen and genetic diversity, biodiversity. Climate is already in the yellow zone. It will reach the red zone in another couple of decades. And that's what the whole net zero talk is all about. But everybody will tell when they will become net zero, after how many decades. They will not tell what they will do next year. That's the whole controversy now. And India is opposing this approach to net zero. So this is a very telling picture of the state of the planet Earth and the role of nitrogen in the growing unsustainability of the planet Earth. And some of the genetic diversity loss is also attributable to changes in nitrogen. So they are not unrelated with each other. And this is a picture on the rate of usage of fertilizer per unit crop area in the world as recently as 2017. As you can see, India, China, Pakistan, South Asia, Europe, and Brazil are the darkest color, and they are the ones which are using more than 100 kilogram per hectare in the world. So these are the countries from where solutions have to come from. Now this is a graph that shows nitrous oxide emissions from various sources which are listed, from waste, from soil, from manure, from transport, etc. And out of them, not nitrous oxide, actually NOx emissions. Yeah. Um, Agricultural soils, which is the green part of the graph, are the biggest contributors. And this is a major concern. And SAS, the second tallest graph, is South Asia. The biggest tallest graph is China. So this is another very telling estimate that was done in the Western world. Out of every 100 units of synthetic fertilizer produced, if you are a vegetarian, only 14% actually reaches your dinner table. And if you are a non-vegetarian, only 4% reaches your dinner table. Because there are a lot of losses along the way. Not all that is produced is consumed. Maybe some is lost here and there in transport, delivery, distribution, or usage. And not all of it is taken up by the crop. And not the entire crop is consumed. You throw the root, stem, leaf, whatever. Only consume the grain or any fruit. And then even in the food, you don't consume everything. You also waste a lot of food. So after accumulating all these losses, the final harvest into human food is as low as 4% if you're a non-vegetarian. So this is used by the International Nitrogen Initiative to argue for increasing the vegetarian content in your food. You don't have to become a total vegetarian. You can become a demetarian, which is reduce your meat consumption by half, because that is considered adequate by medical standards, even for non-vegetarians. Replace that half of the meat by whatever you can take, vegetable or whatever. And in terms of which non-vegetarian diet is environmentally least damaging, just think of the size. The smaller the animal, the lesser damaging it is to the environment. So beef is the worst in terms of environment footprint and nitrogen footprint and everything else. Lamb is slightly better. Chicken is even better. Fish is the best. So uh, the footprint goes down. There is in fact a whole nitrogen footprint activity going on in the whole world. Now this is just to tell you where does India stand in all this. Fortunately, and I'm also fortunate to be a part of this process in the last 20 years. The recognition of nitrogen as becoming the world's next biggest problem after carbon started as early as 2003. This timeline graph shows all the international events on the top and all the South Asian, actually Indian events in the bottom. This is an article I wrote for One Earth earlier this year. The Indian nitrogen group was formed as early as 2003-4 without even knowing that there is already an international nitrogen initiative coming up. And so our recognition of nitrogen as a local problem was as early as the recognition of that as a global problem. Later, with INI discovered us and we discovered INI and we started collaborating. But the fact that we are early players in the game meant that India has had a very fortunate role to play in all the global events that have happened till reactive nitrogen has finally been accepted in the UN as the next most important thing to be addressed in the world. And actually, it is the Indian government which put that resolution and got it passed unanimously in 2019. And this was one of the biggest diplomatic successes. India has never had a resolution passed in the United Nations, though India was one of the founding members and one of the champions to establish the United Nations after the Second World War. And nitrogen gave that very unlikely opportunity for India to showcase its global leadership skills. But this didn't happen overnight. We started Indian Nitrogen Group way back in 2003-4, formalized it in 2006. We joined INI, set up a South Asia Center for them in 2008. We joined UNEP Environment Program in the Nutrient Management Group 2009, hosted the first ever nitrogen conference in India, the fifth in the INI series in 2010, and then expanded in South Asia, set up Sustainable India Trust, which I now head, and then conducted our own Indian nitrogen assessment, the first ever assessment published in 2017. And then we are now coordinating the South Asian nitrogen assessment. Some of the colleagues who have been a part of it are here in the meeting today. It's only with such a huge teamwork that all this would have been possible. And with the huge background and with our own data very well organized and our own understanding of our nitrogen cycle well in control, Indian government was able to have the confidence to go to the UN and with our support get this resolution passed. Some of the publications we produced in the last couple of decades um, for various national international agencies. The first was a policy paper for the National Academy of Agriculture Sciences. The third was a policy document for Indian National Science Academy. The second is a book. The fourth is a special issue on nitrogen in the Platinum Jubilee year of current science. 2017 nitrogen assessment covered all the areas of biogeochemical cycle of nitrogen: agriculture, non-agriculture, transport, waste, atmospheric science, uh, medical, aspects, the health aspects, um, water ecosystem, forest ecosystem. Everything has been covered. The most comprehensive nitrogen assessment anywhere in the world after the European nitrogen assessment of 2011. Only the second in the world. In 2019, we had the fortune of contributing a chapter to the Frontiers report on of the UNEP, which identifies 5 emerging issues of environmental concern to planet Earth. It almost is like a bidding process. So 10 different groups are invited to contribute whatever they think are the 10 most um, important things threatening the planet Earth, and they pick 5 out of them. And we bid it with nitrogen, and that was picked up as one of the top threats. In the same week in which Indian government went to the UN with the resolution, so we were working on multiple fronts to create a momentum, to create not only a scientific opinion but also a diplomatic opinion uh, for getting the UN resolution in place. This is that famous resolution of 2019 called Sustainable Nitrogen Management, barely a couple of pages, um, unanimously approved, and suddenly making the world sit up and take notice of India as an emerging leader in environmental diplomacy. Quite unlikely it might look like, looking at the way our environmental laws are being diluted for coal and mining and various things. But that's what we are as a country, right? Um, like every other country, they have to balance between domestic contradictions and international postures. So one of the things that came out in some of our studies, and this is an article based on 40 years of nitrogen trials in rice, produced by reviewed by Dr. Adhya Tapanadhya, who was then the director of Central Rice Research Institute, Cuttack. Basically, it shows that as the fertilizer consumption increased through the Green Revolution years, the role of nitrogen fertilizer in the total yield, that is partial factor productivity, was falling, which means basically nitrogen use efficiency was falling. By the mid 80s, and that's also the trends in plant science graph I showed you in the beginning, it tapered off. So now we don't get the kind of yield benefits with nitrogen that we were getting in the 60s and the 70s. So um, even if we believe that there were dramatic yields with fertilizers in the 70s, yes, there were perhaps, but they were not going to increase forever, because there is a limit, both genetic limit as well as agronomic limit, and unless we breach it by continuous improvement. So this has become an iconic image that defines the situation of nitrogen use efficiency in Indian agriculture. The map on the right is produced by our NGO, uh, Society for Conservation of Nature, on the district-wise use of nitrogen fertilizer in India. The darker the color, the highest the use. The usual suspects, the coastal regions and the northwestern parts, use the highest amounts, and many parts of the country, the central and the northwestern parts, in fact, use much less than what they should use. And this was both these pictures were incorporated in the UNEP report, Our Nutrient World, which some of us had the fortune of co-authoring and co-editing way back in 2013. So this was what I was telling you. While methane from rice fields has more or less stabilized over the last few decades, nitrous oxide from agriculture fields continuously increased and is no longer uh, the second. It is actually higher than methane. Now, the urea indigenous price, 75% is paid, market price is paid by the government, 25% is paid by the farmer. And if 25-30% is the nitrogen use efficiency, that means you recover 25% of the fertilizer as your harvest. The rest gets wasted. So farmer recovers what he pays for. He pays 25% price, he recovers 25% harvest. Government pays to 75% and only buys pollution worth 50,000 crores. I mean, that's easy to say as a slogan, but it's more complicated than that. Government doesn't know which kg is going to pollute and which kg is going into the crop, nor does the farmer know. That's a different matter. Government did bring about some policy innovations like making all urea as neem coated urea, and we find that that has stabilized the growth rate of fertilizer use in India over the last 5 years. It has also reduced the urea bag size from 50 kg to 45 kg. So it was expected that that will bring a 10% reduction in the usage of fertilizer, though it did not exactly bring 10% reduction, but it certainly stabilized the growth rate of fertilizer. So that's what we have captured here as a part of the Indian nitrogen assessment. The scenario, the business usual scenario, the blue line would have kept on growing, but neem coated urea has more or less stabilized the nitrous oxide emission from agriculture at the current rate. That's our projection into the future, but whether we can arrest it at that level or not is something that depends on what else we do. We also know how much nitrogen is lost from poultry. Poultry dropping, the bird dropping is an excellent fertilizer. Originally, that was the only fertilizer that the world had, just like manure. Uh, Later, synthetic fertilizers came. Uh, 1 million ton worth of nitrogen is excreted from poultry, and if we convert use all of it as fertilizer, we already use quite a bit, but a lot of also lost. We can both prevent the pollution and recover the nutrients. In the same way, cattle, buffaloes, we know the numbers, and we know how much manure can be recycled back into agriculture. We know how many cities and districts in the country have groundwater nitrate contamination. Um, as you can see, 50 micrograms per uh, ml is the WHO standard, whereas almost all the cities are above that limit. And most of the source of that is either animal manure, urine, or fertilizer. So the intensive dairy farms around the cities actually are also contributing to nitrogen pollution. Because green revolution and white revolution have moved in opposite directions. So the crop farmers are having to buy manure, the animal livestock farmers are having to buy grass, and both are wasting their wastes. The farmers are burning their stubble, which could have been animal feed, whereas the livestock guys are throwing the dung and urine or simply burning it away as dung cakes, which is all adding to the pollution. We need to connect white and green revolution all over again, because the waste of one is a raw material for the other. We need business models for this to make sustainable agriculture. Sewage is expected to actually take over fertilizer as the single largest source of nitrous oxide sometime in this decade itself, or it may have already happened. When we get the data, we will know, because sewage is growing much faster, maybe 10 times faster than agricultural nitrogen use. This is the wastewater and sewage scenario into up to 2030. So we could reduce by better sewage management and bringing back nutrients from sewage and wastewater into agriculture, um, cut down a lot of nitrous oxide emissions. Similarly, from transport, we can reduce NOx by cutting down on diesel. Petrol is not such a big problem. Diesel is a bigger problem. CNG is still okay. Electrical is even better. But for electricity, if you're using coal, then it is not as good. So if you are using solar electricity instead of coal electricity, then electric vehicles would be absolutely environment friendly. But coal electricity based electric transport is not really a very good solution. So these are some of the figures from vehicular transport, the amount of savings that are possible if we take proper measures. We can get into them when we have time, because I think I've already taken an hour. We also even know by the type of vehicle and railway, shipping, aviation, not just the roads. So we actually construct all these scenarios for the kind of uh, fuel and for the kind of vehicle that we have, either using IPCC methodology or our own. But the important thing, lesson to learn, is that the gains from CNG introduction in Delhi public transport in the early 2000s were lost when diesel cars were allowed to enter into the market. Before that, there were no diesel cars, there were only petrol cars, and diesel only went for tractors and trucks and buses. It is after CNG that was introduced for public, buses and trucks, that government should not have gone for diesel cars, which they went. All the global brands came to India, and they again poisoned the air. Well, this is a bit sales talk for the International Nitrogen Initiative because I had it, but there's no time for it. It has essentially being the torchbearer for highlighting the role of nitrogen globally and pushing the governments with all the scientific evidence to do what they can do to move towards sustainable nitrogen management. It is actually as a fresh INI chair that I was able to nudge our own diplomats in Nairobi to go ahead and take our technical help and push strongly for the resolution on nitrogen management. Recently, we had a conference, a triennial conference of INI. A Berlin Declaration was adopted, putting together, summarizing all the scientific evidence and asking all the governments to now start seriously implementing the UN resolution on sustainable nitrogen management. And some special issues of journals, various journals are coming on reactive nitrogen. Environment research letters is one, for example. Environment research communications is one, and frontiers in plant science is one. So every year, special issues of journals, and I've been associated as editor in some of them, are coming, and this is a documentation of our own capacity building for South Asia. These are some of the other special issues that have already been published or are being published. They're attracting a lot of attention, and we see that as this whole awareness about nitrogen increases, interdisciplinary convergence of nitrogen from agriculture, transport, other areas is growing very fast. So the field is also becoming more and more interdisciplinary and becoming more useful for the policymakers than it would normally have if we were only doing our own, narrow molecular biology kind of thing. And this is just to, quickly taper it off by showing the number of different international bodies: the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Montreal Protocol on Air Pollution, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Global Action on Marine Pollution. All these various different intergovernmental international bodies can be assisted by the International Nitrogen Initiative globally, or by us, Indian Nitrogen Group, nationally, to um, give the necessary importance to nitrogen in each of these intergovernmental frameworks, and try to reduce their footprint on the environment and improve the sustainability to that extent. Well, to now start summarizing, Indian scientists have been proactive on nitrogen globally, and that has helped us a lot, both to understand our own science, to channelize our science in a better direction as a part of the larger picture, to give better advice to the Indian government. In fact, in order to implement the sustainable nitrogen resolution, Indian government just last month has put together an interministerial national nitrogen steering committee, which includes Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Chemicals, Fertilizers, Ministry of Science and Technology, Ministry of Earth Science, CPCB, and a few others. Some of us are also, as academicians, we are members of that committee, and we hope that we will get the necessary inter-ministerial coordination to be able to do what needs to be done to reduce the environmental impact of nitrogen. And we believe that while India may have been catching up with the climate on the with the global environmental diplomacy uh, in the carbon era, because the West was leading it and India was catching up. But in nitrogen, we have the capacity, and we have already proven in some ways that we can actually lead. So if you were following the world in carbon, you might be one of those, if not the only one, to be leading the world on nitrogen. And these are some of the things that we need to do. In agriculture, we have to improve the nitrogen use efficiency, minimize wastage. In transport, we have to go for low emission combustion. Bring NOx capture, NOx scrubber technology, which is available but expensive, but we have to bring it to reduce PM 2.5 and air quality problem and visibility problem, smog. We have to improve waste recycling, improve food system sustainability. Um, One of the things that happens in any economy as it grows is large scale movement of people from vegetarianism to non-vegetarianism. Fortunately, in India, even diehard non-vegetarians don't take non-veg 3 times a day, 7 days a week. And India is one of the few countries in the world where non-vegetarian dishes are also prepared with some vegetables in combinations, like palak or like other things. And this is a very unique, culture that can be used to bring back that balance. And with, if not exact vegetarianism, maybe Demetarianism might be a useful thing from the environmental point of view, if we can do that. I don't want to bore you with my own research, but just to show you, in my own little small way as a molecular biologist, and by keeping in mind this larger picture, we have been phenotyping for nitrogen use efficiency because people don't know how to differentiate a nitrogen use efficient rice and an inefficient rice. And we started with rice because in Indian agriculture, rice is the largest fertilizer consuming crop because it has the lowest nitrogen use efficiency. 37% of all urea in India only goes into rice, 24% into wheat. So if you just take rice and wheat, the traditional green revolution crops, coming back to Norman Borlaug and his contributions, more than almost two-thirds of all nitrogen fertilizer is just taken by these two crops in India. So if you have to improve nitrogen use efficiency in Indian agriculture, you have to start with rice and wheat. That's the best, tribute we can give to Norman Borlaug to correct some of the problems that his work had left behind unintentionally. So in that direction, we have discovered the phenotype for nitrogen use efficiency, which was an unsolved problem for many decades. We have tried to link that phenotype with um shortlisted traits for crop improvement. Out of 25 different traits, we found 20 to be nitrogen responsive, of which only 8 were actually contributing to nitrogen use efficiency. So not every trait that responds to nitrogen fertilizer necessarily contribute to use efficiency. So that's an important distinction between N response and N efficiency, which we were able to bring biologically in this paper, which was actually published earlier this year. And we are able to use some bioinformatics to identify some key genes, predict some gene targets for crop improvement, and we are also converging from G protein signaling to nitrogen use efficiency. something which I started way back in my PhD, but at that point, these links were not so clear. Now we are able to bring that up. Thank you so much for your attention, and sorry for the extra time that I may have taken. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raghuram. I think you literally took us through a journey which you have gone through, and I think more than anything else, I think you have brought in a very fundamental issue which we have to address whether we like it or not. I think just like we say smoking is injurious to health, I think you have to come out with a nice slogan for nitrogen use, so that we don't create more havoc. Probably, as you rightly said, health is a fundamental issue. We should focus health rather than climate change. I think you have a very valid point. So I leave the floor open to others to suggest or ask questions, then we can discuss. So the floor is open. Yeah. So Dr. Tiwari, you would like to make no. Dr. Tiwari, you would like to make some comments? It would be great.
He has been one of the pillars in the early stages of the establishment of the Indian Nitrogen Group.
Yes, I'm aware of that. That's why I said his own share of experience will help us to understand better. Dr. Tiwari?
Yeah, hello. It was very nice and enlightening to listen to Professor Raghuram in this lecture and go through the initial years before we spotted Professor Raghuram from center of this down to earth. Before that, I was doing some very rudimentary write-ups, etc., on nitrogen. And that's why I learned, although I'm not an agriculture scientist, but I learned the Haber-Bosch process and the links to this. It was very enlightening to listen to Professor Raghuram review, and I actually enjoyed. So as I was listening to him, I was also going through the acts that we did. Now I am not active in nitrogen. I am just listener and commenter. But one little question I want to ask, there was one slide which Professor Raghuram showed, in which the contribution from NOx and HNO3 were shown on the same map. In the case of ammonia, the India is shown as the maximum emitter, but China is not shown there. Whereas in the case of NOx, China and India are almost equal. Why this difference? How is China is not becoming as a major contributor for ammonia pollution? Can you please enlighten on that?
Well, I'll try. Ammonia estimation and its modeling has been one of the what should I say, complexities in Indian nitrogen work. The actual estimate of where is that graph? I'm just trying to go back to that graph.
It's one of these red ones.
Yeah.
One of these red
ones. Not in
yes.
this one.
Yes. I think.
No. Ammonia is the different one.
No, but the one
this
bottom.
One, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, this one.
Yes.
So this is an Edgar simulation. Now there are two things. Of course, Dr. Umesh Kulshrestha, who is an expert on ammonia emission, could have told better. One is that there is Himalayas being a physical barrier on the northern frontier of this red zone. That creates a localized pattern. That is one part of the thing. The other part of it is a couple of papers that Umesh Kulshrestha has published about atmospheric chemistry, the pH changes in and moisture in air, and the changes that it has on the conversions of ammonia to other compounds, and the ratio of dry deposition and wet deposition. If these things are all properly taken into account, he estimates that the the load would be significantly lesser than what is estimated by Edgar.
I
So
see.
this is an area which uh, is still evolving, and I think it will, as we get more fine-grained data on the atmospheric chemistry, and as we improve our modeling methodologies, this will become, I mean, our own
Better. I see.
estimates might get more and more accepted. One of the problems in this field, which of course Tiwari himself knows, is that many of these models are developed for assuming laminar airflow. You know, they don't
Yeah.
consider turbulence, they don't consider, other factors. So in global models, when you make, you can't account for all the local variations. So
Hmm.
that's the so uncertainty levels in ammonia estimation
Very good.
is
Okay.
the highest among these three on a relative
Okay.
scale. Uh, but still it is high. Whether it is this high or slightly less high is a different matter.
Okay.
That's all that I can say at this moment.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Raghuram,
Yes, sir.
we talk about nitrogen cycle in the old style, but from the kind of data you have created now, don't you think our textbook should be corrected to account for nitrogen, its products, and its cycle, and what remains and what gets consumed? Don't you think so?
Absolutely. We haven't yet started getting to that level, but in the West, they have already started doing it. The University of Edinburgh, as a part of our own Indo-UK project, had started a massive open online course, MOOC,
Hmm.
with some 40 lectures on all aspects of the nitrogen problem.
Hmm.
It's called the Nitrogen Challenge.
Hmm.
It was initially launched in English. Now it is available in Hindi, in Bengali, I think even in Urdu, Nepali.
Wow.
So that is hopefully going to, and more languages are being brought in to expand that content.
Hmm.
And once enough number of people in different parts of the country, educators, get to see this in different languages, and they start, and this is a free course, so it doesn't really, it's an online free course. Hopefully they will bring some of that into the textbook knowledge when they write the books. That's what we are hoping for. This is a very recent development in the last couple of years.
Okay.
The English version was launched 2 years ago. All other versions are now launching, like every quarter a new language is launched. I think the latest is Spanish, and
Okay.
German is also coming up. So as such ready material in one place, educational material becomes available
Hmm.
as a resource for teachers. Introducing them into the syllabus and getting into the books might become far easier, but the preparatory content is sometimes more challenging, especially for an interdisciplinary topic like this.
No, but what I was thinking was, suppose we start introducing at say fifth standard or sixth standard, we start teaching, and then keep on increasing it that so that by the time they come to 12th class or something, they would have slowly learned and become sensitive to this whole issue, because here is an interesting example of, you see it around.
Yeah,
For example, you said ammonia is being released. The child can test and create a database around this area, how much ammonia is in the air, or a NOx is there in the air, or some simple assay kits. And whether we could create, because, and you, very interesting is, you said northwest region is one of the biggest pollutants. Am I right? So I could ask Utpal Bora to initiate, because he is director of the environment program in IIT Guwahati. I think we both could have a talk with him and introduce this, because because you are saying Northwest, you showed as the darkest region. I
Yeah.
think that needs to be attended at a much faster rate. Don't you think so?
Interestingly, this is also the Green Revolution region of India.
Okay. Okay.
So this is the Green Revolution belt, starting from Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, this, and then going up to Assam, where irrigation is guaranteed, and where cereal production is the highest, and where multiple crops per year is the norm, and therefore fertilizer consumption throughout the year is the norm.
So Brahmaputra is a good, interesting place to study this.
Yes,
Wherever Brahmaputra.
in fact, rightly or wrongly, the whole northeastern region fertilizer consumption has been relatively low, very low as compared to the rest of the country.
Okay.
Partly because of their topsoil being regularly replenished, and their agriculture locations in valleys and such places are such that they don't really require very high doses, and many of them are not doing multiple crops in a year, and some of them are still maintaining that crop rotation, traditional rotation with legumes. So they were not used to taking high fertilizer loads. But in fact,
Okay.
the government is trying to push fertilizers in the northeast in the hope that the next phase of green revolution will happen in the northeast. And
Okay.
it's a bit of a controversial area where
Okay.
one has to balance the food production needs with the sustainability needs, both in the northeast and the rest of the country. It might be possible to expand food production in the northeast without replicating exactly the same model that we have
Okay.
been following in Punjab, Haryana, and that's the growing public opinion even there.
Okay.
So hopefully it will eventually fructify.
I think we must have a discussion with Utpal Bora because he's quite influential in that belt.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think I'll arrange a meeting with you so that let us try to start some. Another is, why are you not trying in Orissa in a bigger way?
Yes.
Because Orissa also must be having the same problem.
Well, we were involved with the nutrient loading project on Chilika Lake, where we found that Chilika Lake was losing its unique fish population, and dolphins, and some of the other biodiversity, mainly because of loading of urban waste from Bhubaneswar and Cuttack cities. It is located between the two, and also a lot of rice cultivation in the nearby riverine area. It is the rivers that feed into that lake, and the lake is right at the end of the at the coast. It's actually lagoon, not a lake. It meets the sea. So part of it is freshwater, part of it is salt water.
Salt water, correct.
So we found that nitrogen pollution and phosphorus pollution, largely attributable to wastes and fertilizers, is responsible for some of the damage to Chilika Lake. With a UNEP project, with the help of Chilika Development Authority, they have done certain actions. They have done a hydrological intervention to open the sea link with the lagoon on the one side that got blocked, and on the other side they regulated aquaculture in that area. It's very popular.
Yes.
They regulated fertilizer use in the rice cultivation areas, and that has shown already the nutrient pollutant levels in the Chilka Lake have improved quite an extent. And Dr. Ramesh Ramachandran from the Coastal Institute in Chennai has developed a ecosystem health report card for Chilka Lake, which includes nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus as a part of the ecosystem health, and that is now globally shown as a success story, as an example where a threatened Ramsar site. No, Ramsar site is a UN classification for threatened ecological sites.
Okay.
So Chilika was one of them. It has recently been removed from the Ramsar list, after all these interventions happened. And I was on the steering committee of that project. We had to really fight a lot to get everything going the way we wanted it to go, because CDA was being run by IAS officers. Sometimes we really have to push them hard. Yeah, we
So I
did a
think-
little bit there, but a lot more can be done. I agree.
No, what I was only wondering is that with all your, broad perspective, can we draw some action plans for schools and college children, especially during summer vacations,
Yes.
everybody is talking internship and working. Why not we put them on to, because this doesn't cost you much.
Yeah, I need people. We can work with PhD students or postdocs or even college students. A nitrogen footprint is a nice thing anybody can do.
Yes.
If you know what are the various input sources, you know what are the various output sources, with a few little measurements here and there, and a few standard, loss values which are already known. What
Yes.
percent food is wasted? What percent, emissions come from wastewater? One can actually learn some of these things as a part of college projects or school projects. We need to develop that. I'm looking for people who are willing to partner with the Sustainable India Trust
Okay.
to take it up, learn the nitrogen footprinting. It's now available as a software. There's a stepwise things people have to follow. You can do footprinting for IP University. You can do footprinting for a lake or for a state at any level. We used to do it for a conference also.
In fact, I suggest, why don't you catch hold of our student Amit Tuteja? He's doing a lot of
Yeah.
sustainable
told him.
development. I also talked to him whether we could activate in our own little way.
We
So
are now.
Murali-
We have recently submitted a project to UNEP
Hmm.
through our Sustainable India Trust to actually quantify the total amount of waste water that is treated in Delhi, because in the last 7-8 years,
Hmm.
Delhi sewage treatment capacity has increased from less than 30%, which is the national average, to almost 90%.
Okay.
That is one very good thing that the Aam Aadmi government has done. They have opened all the closed sewage water treatment plants. They have constructed new plants, enhanced capacities, and have reached almost 90% treatment capabilities. So we have tried to project this as an example to UNEP. This is the best case example of a small city state that has achieved 90% treatment capacity for sewage water,
Yes.
out of which a lot of water is recovered for usable purposes, but the sludge that remains is rich in nutrients.
Correct.
So UNEP is interested in knowing how much of that sludge nutrient are actually brought back to the food production system.
Okay.
Right now, I think they're only using it for, growing trees on the footpaths. But if it can be improvised from there, and if it can actually come back to food production systems in the surrounding areas of Delhi, they are willing to invest a lot of money, and then they are willing to showcase this as an example of what the rest of India can do. Just like
Okay.
Chilka as an example of what other lakes
Yeah.
can do. So we have to build these kinds of working success stories as models that can be replicated one by one. So we have, in that sense, moving from theoretical, demonstration of possibilities to practical demonstration of pilot success stories.
Very, very. I think what you presented today has to be, presented or circulated to more people to listen to it, to just, catch up, because there's a huge research inputs which can be put into the whole thing.
Yeah.
Professor Murali, would like to make some comments?
Couple of quick comments. One is a personal thing. I'm very deeply impressed by the broad sweep and the quality of good science that has come out of this. Politically speaking, also, as he himself pointed out, This is one of the very few areas in science where Indians have recognized the problem, if not earlier, at least simultaneously with the West, because we are always accused as camp followers, total Indian science. This is an opportunity I think we should grab. So the most important thing is now the action plan,
Yes.
right from school education to higher things. My suggestion, of course, not as any authority, that this so-called interministerial panel should work through Ministry of Education and open Center for Human Sciences in every university and college campus. And like the Madhav Gadgil's landscape project, involve school students. Kannan is ideal for this, and see that it becomes a movement and not simply a
Yes.
scientific contribution. Contribution is already there, evident, and your visibility on the international scene, along with Adya and others, I think it's highly impressive and laudable. But I think you must make it now because of the importance to public health. It should penetrate much deeper in the social structure.
Yes.
So, and academically, it should also sound healthy. Therefore, I feel that a center for human sciences where multiple disciplines from humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, mathematics, computer science, modeling people, public health people, environmental people, everybody should come in under one umbrella, and a unique administrative structure should be provided. And for that, only IAS people are good to create that infrastructure. We felt a similar problem in multiple ovulation embryo transfer technology program in Buffaloes, where ultimately the translation could never be done because you need the cooperation of the animal husbandry ministry of each state government, which is a monarch by itself. So they never recognize. So it is the biggest failure in Indian science when you look at Buffalo herd improvement projects. It's a scandal almost.
Yeah.
I think this
Is it
project, which is so important for public health and also its scientific worthiness. I see very high quality science coming out of this, but it should not remain academic. I think this is the biggest opportunity to become world leader, but let it penetrate deeper into society. It should become public consciousness.
Absolutely.
And for that, academic ground is very important. Center for Human Science, where we don't label somebody as biologist or something. We simply attack the problem and look at it. Your Chilka Lab work is like that. It has reached deeper sections of society. Excellent, sir. Very good. I learnt a lot.
Thank you
In
very
fact, Muralidhar, Raghuram was one person who could exploit our Sitaramam's work, that nitrogen utilization efficiency, phenotypic one which was developed. You remember Sitaramam used to talk and nobody understood what he was saying. I think Raghuram was one man who could pin him down, bring him to the department, do the experiment and publish the work,
Good.
So I think Raghuram has a tenacity to pull out the bright minds and, translate their ideas into reality, And I think the whole beauty I liked about this work is that, you don't need genetics to do it. Am I right, Raghuram? This identifying this phenotype, there is no learning genetics in this. What do you say?
Yeah, traditionally, even the crop plant breeding people needed a visible trait when they did the breeding.
Correct.
So, like a tall plant, short plant, we see the whole dwarf variety, which became such an important thing in Green Revolution. Dwarfness was such a easily recognizable, trait to the naked eye.
Correct.
And dwarfness was important for Green Revolution.
Correct.
So in the same way, if you identify, in fact, plant height also comes up as an important issue for nitrogen use efficiency. Whereas in our case, higher height is better for NUE, whereas agriculture has gone towards shorter height.
Shorter one. Okay.
Higher shoot to root ratio means more overground productivity, but higher shoot to root ratio also means poor input use efficiency.
Yes.
So one of the problems that I face is that popular talk is a different thing, but in our own research, whenever we come up with findings uh, um, that are scientifically valid, but they turn the entire traditional agricultural wisdom on its head.
Can't hear you.
So I tell them tall plants are better for nitrogen use efficiency. Agricultural scientists say you are destroying our, green revolution knowledge of 50 years. I say more roots is better for nutrients. He's saying root is a wasteful tissue.
Yes.
So we need to actually, go back and revisit some of these old myths that have also got ossified long after green revolution has reached its saturation point. It had its important role to play at a very crucial juncture in history. People should have continuously improved it with all these things. That got lost. They were just mechanically replicating all those things that Borlaug did in the 50s.
Correct.
That was the problem.
Professor Tiwari, you wanted to make a statement? Sorry. Yeah.
After while hearing Professor Muralidhar, I got this idea. This interministerial committee, does it have a
The mandate. I lost your voice there.
I want to ask Professor Ram.
Uh-huh. Can you switch off the video so that you can get better bandwidth for the audio?
Should I say what is the
एक मिनट वीडियो ऑफ करके बोलिए, आ जाएगा आवाज. वो शेयर करता है ना ऑडियो वीडियो. Has he left? Anyway, if he was talking about, yeah, he joined. जी.
Yeah.
You are muted. आपको ऑडियो नहीं वीडियो म्यूट करना है.
I'm sorry. Okay. Now I got it. I'm sorry. Is the Ministry of Health a part of the interministerial group here in nitrogen?
जी नहीं, अभी तो नहीं है.
तो मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि उनको लाना चाहिए. And since
बिल्कुल लाना चाहिए.
And WHO also might have should also be alerted about it. And since our Professor Soumya Swaminathan sitting as DG there, it might be easier to move things at this moment.
Absolutely.
So,
in fact, the minister who helped us in pushing the resolution was himself a doctor. He was in charge of environment at that time.
Okay. So this will be good. I think Professor Soumya Swaminathan can be, in fact, this program will be more effective to the people and to the government and policy makers if it is headed by health issue rather than agriculture issue.
Yes.
Because agriculture, there is a lot of confusion. There are pro and cons and people in favor and people not in favor. But health is something which will concern everybody. And everybody will agree to this problem of nitrogen.
And there's also an interesting trigger to this. Some 3 years ago, WHO, UNEP, and FAO, all three came together to have a joint consultative committee on the health and environmental effects of pesticides and fertilizers.
Okay.
A resolution adopted in the third Environment Assembly asking all these concerned UN agencies to make a consolidated report and place it before the fifth Environment Agency.
I see.
I had the fortune to be, on behalf of INI, a representative on that committee. We went through 2 years of intensive discussions on pesticides and fertilizers. And the report is finally tabled, and it is waiting for the second part of the fifth Environment Assembly to take place, because they were not very keen on discussing critical things in a online meeting. So, but then it is not likely that it will be a physical meeting anytime soon. When that happens, and if that report is adopted, which most likely it will be, we will have an international document jointly produced by WHO, UNEP, and FAO, giving a common mandate for dealing with environmental and health aspects of fertilizers and pesticides. And there also we had some of the representatives from health ministry, chemicals and fertilizers ministry, and so they are aware of this process, so we might be able to engage them better, as you said. And also, fortunately, the terms of reference of this multi-ministerial committee are not very narrowly defined, so they gave us reasonable
Nice.
latitude, and we are now in the process of defining our own terms of reference, where we are asking ourselves that we should co-opt additional ministries if required to make sure that all the stakeholder ministries are adequately represented.
Yes.
And health is one of them,
and
which
they're
was
willing
already in our.
to and also that they're willing to work together. See, this is where the problem. I remember this
Yeah, that
when
we really
climate
have to
change becomes a
see.
crisis in
Yes.
1987. This multi-ministry committee was made to tackle the problem of climate change, or so-called IGBP program, International Geosphere. Professor Menon was the chairman of that. He was used to be Science and Technology Minister, and all the secretaries were there. But that government fell through. But afterwards, this committee did not last because each secretary did not want to listen to somebody else telling him what he should do for IGBP, and they all had
Yeah,
their own
this is a
independent program. But same thing should not happen here in nitrogen. This we have to
that
see.
won't, because here we have a government which does not allow that level of autonomy to any ministry.
Yes, that's
Once a
okay.
decision is taken in the PMO, everybody will fall in line. So there are both good and bad aspects of that, but we can work with the good aspects of that and hope that
Yes, yes.
that kind of support and mandate will be available to this committee. So we have to work very, very carefully and make sure that we don't ruffle any feathers anywhere. Stick to our science, stick to being objective and neutral. So it's going to be a very tightrope walk for a loudmouth like me. So, but the good thing is, Shailesh Naik is the chairman, and as a founder secretary of of the Ministry of Earth
Okay.
Sciences,
Okay. That's a good thing. That's a good thing.
he is a very and we have worked with him earlier in a few committees, so he's quite approachable that way. Ramesh is there, I am there, Adhya is there. So when four people are compatible, the other four can be handled, hopefully. So we just have to hope for the best. And it's also high level because they have given joint secretary level people in every ministry, not
Okay.
lower level.
I think
So in about a month's time, we would be able to tell you whether the expanded terms of reference, as we are asking, is actually going to be available for us, and whether the expanded participation of stakeholder ministries is going to be possible. If one of these two things are clinched, the rest hopefully we'll be able to clinch.
I think it has been a very, enlightening talk, Ram, and I think a lot of actions have to be taken. As last time when Al Sommer was presenting on vitamin A, he used a very nice word, short form called SPAC, SPAC. See some anomaly, then ponder over it, act, and the last one he said is convincing. Convincing people is the toughest job. You have done the rest of the part, and I think you have done an excellent job. I think there should be a campaign to promote and, like a movement to convince people, look, either you do it or perish, it is as from what you say, kind of health problems we are seeing today probably has, NOx and other things have a bigger role to play than what we imagine. That's why you rightly said, instead of climate change, let us look at health. I think if we can make a pamphlet, saying, do you know this is due to this has contributed, something like that, like they did it for cigarette smoking is injurious to health, NOx is injurious Raghuram, I think some campaign has to be started,
Yes.
That's my, and wherever we can be of help, we'll definitely join hands, because we quite appreciate that from what you presented, that we can spread the word around. Anyway, thank you so much, Raghuram, for, it was a very, very enlightening one, and I will upload the video for others to see, so that, we get more audience and awareness program. So thank you so much. And I must thank Dr. Tiwari, Professor Muralidhar, Shivakumar, Vishweshwar, a whole bunch of people who have been constant. It's great to have you all, and all my other friends who are there. And we look forward to the next one is on cure for diabetes. That's going to be presented next month around similar time. So please kindly join us at that time. So thank you once again, Raghuram. In spite of your, you took time off to, be with us. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. It's my pleasure to get the patient hearing of all of you luminaries. Thank you so much.
Okay. May I add 1 second, Professor Kannan?
Yeah, sure, sir. Sure.
I am not at the same level of you scientists. I mean, I strayed away from the mainstream of science years back, but it is great to be back with all of you. And since the basics are not forgotten, the contents of Dr. Professor Raghuram are eye-opening, and it's an extremely explosive issue that he has brought out. I think it's really a matter of concern. I'm very happy I could join all of you, and I'm going back mentally in my late science stream. Taking me back to 1970s. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was really great.
Vishweshwar did a BSc chemistry honors. Then he went into banking for his own family reason, and he has held very high positions. And great lover of attending our talks, and he has been as a great source of encouragement. Thank you, Vishweshwar. And we look forward to you being part of us.
Please.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.